Hello, everybody. For those joining, we'll just get started in a minute or two after we give people a chance to get settled. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us live if you're watching via Zoom or YouTube, or welcome if you're viewing this the recording later on. I'm David Leonard, President of the Boston Public Library, and will be your host for today's conversation and program. Thank you again so much for joining us. Very much looking forward to the conversation with our guest today. Today's program is being presented in conjunction with the Museum of African American History and is focused on the winner of their MAAH Stone Book Award. So a few words to let you know about our great partner, the Museum of African American History. This organization was founded in 1967 and is New England's largest museum dedicated to preserving, conserving, and interpreting the contributions of African Americans. The museum has two locations, one on Beacon Hill in Boston and the other on Nantucket Island. We're of course coming to you virtually today. The Museum of African American History, or MAAH, pronounced MAAH, the MAAH Stone Book Award was founded in 2017 in partnership with the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. It's an annual prize that encourages scholarship and writing within the field of African American history and culture by awarding a $25,000 winning prize and two $5,000 finalist prizes to the authors of exceptional adult nonfiction books written in a literary style published in the prior year. This is the award's third year, and it's the second year in a row that the winner of the award has given an author talk at the Boston Public Library. This is a partnership that the museum and the library are committed to continuing to grow in the years to come. And so yesterday's winner, because the award event was yesterday, and in addition to Dr. Favors, who was last night's award event winner, we also celebrated two 2020 finalists, Tiffany Lethebo-King for The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, and Kiange Yamatha Taylor for Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership. These are both excellent works that we also recommend. And you can find more information about these books, the Book Award, and the museum by following the Book Award on social media at MAAH Stone Book Award, and also by visiting their website, www.maahstonebookaward.org. The links will be posted in the chat by our great staff throughout. So I would particularly recommend that you visit the virtual library on their website to discover the more than 120 books that examine and celebrate African American history and culture that have been submitted for this award over the last few years. All books have been published within the past 3 years, and they offer exciting new presentations on both contemporary and historical issues, figures, and events that impact African American and American history. And so to our special guest for today's program. Jelani M. Favors is the Associate Professor of History at Clayton State University. He earned his doctoral and master's degrees from The Ohio State University and earned a bachelor's degree in history from North Carolina A&T State University, an institution that also figures in his book. He is a native of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Favor's research and commentary has also appeared in several media outlets: The Washington Post, CNN, The Atlantic, The Chronicle for Higher Education, C-SPAN, and The Conversation. In addition to the 2020 MAAH Stone Book Award, Shelter in a Time of Storm has also won the 2020 Lillian Smith Book Award and was one of 5 finalists for the 2020 Pauli Murray Award. Dr. Favors, welcome to the program. Jelani, congratulations on the award. And would you just tell us what it was like to get this award and when you found out and what it meant to you?
Hey, David, how you doing? Good afternoon to you as well as to all the viewers. It's really great to be here with you. The award was, wow, it was a game changer and certainly thrilled myself and my family. We were incredibly honored to be the recipients of this year's award. And I say we because, of course, writing is often a joint project and it calls for the support of your family and your friends. And so this project was not something that was done alone. Indeed, I thank my family and I thank my friends for being an incredible network for me. So it's been an incredible year, and I'm overwhelmed with joy that the book has been received and recognized by my peers, by my colleagues. And I think it's a very important work and a very timely work. And I think it has a lot to say about the importance of educational spaces and the role that they play in shaping young activists.
Well, I have a few questions lined up, and we'll be inviting the audience to submit questions via the Q&A box on Zoom a little bit later in the program. But just to give people a flavor of the topics and the writing, I'd like to just invite you to read a piece from the book, just so we can get a sense of the topics that you've picked up here.
Absolutely. Every book has an origin story. And so this book really began, the seeds of it, the intellectual seeds of it began in the class that I took at Ohio State called The History of Black Education, taught by Dr. Beverly Gordon. And in that class, we were introduced to, of course, a ton of historiographical narratives that had emerged that attempted to shape and define what Black education really was and has been within this country. And one of the things that quickly jumped out for me is that there was a void, particularly in our understanding on the role of Black colleges. These were institutions that emerged in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, while slavery was still going on within this country. And they immediately emerged as a space where a powerful counter-narrative could be formed, a counter-narrative that rejected white supremacy, a counter-narrative that rejected the idea of African-Americans having no humanity and no culture and nothing to give. And so I want to open up by reading a piece from the introduction, which really defines 2 of the main theoretical anchors of this book. And that is the second curriculum, as well as the idea of communitas, which is a phrase which I borrowed and I recast from Victor Turner, who was a cultural anthropologist. So I'll briefly read this portion and a couple of other paragraphs. It begins as such. It says, quote, "Beyond the written course of study, at Black colleges, an unwritten second curriculum thrived. This second curriculum defined the bond between teacher and student, inspiring youth to develop a linked sense of fate with the race. This second curriculum was a pedagogy of hope, grounded in idealism, race consciousness, and cultural nationalism. More importantly, within the non-collapsible space of Black colleges, this instruction and mentoring was beyond the reach of outsiders. Emerging from the teacher-student relationship, this second curriculum was shielded from the hostilities of whites who, despite their best efforts, remained unaware of how fruitful this association would eventually become. While the bond shared between teachers and students was critical in the development of the second curriculum, it was not the only way or means in which it was delivered. The space where freedom dreams were shared was just as important. Peers emboldened each other as they swapped stories of Black liberation, challenged each other in the classroom, and bantered back and forth in the privacy of their dormitories. Students were exposed to a virtual who's who of the Black literati who traveled the Black college lecture circuit and espoused messages of idealism and race consciousness. Black colleges sporadically offered classes on African-American history and became some of the foremost champions and promoters of Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week. As their confidence and self-esteem grew, so too did their ability to muster critiques against white supremacy. Within their fortified interstitial spaces, African-American students established what cultural anthropologist Victor Turner has termed communitas. Turner used the term to describe the sense of unity found in religious pilgrimage. Though other critics have deepened and criticized aspects of this idea, this book seeks to recast Turner's term. Here, Communitas offers a conceptual framework to describe the vital space that Black colleges provided, offering shelter from the worst elements of a white supremacist society that sought to undermine, overlook, and render impotent the intellectual capacity of Black youth. Turner argues that the Latin term communitas implies the practice of building social relationship as opposed to an area of common living. Furthermore, Turner theories on communitas highlights, quote, symbolic rites of passage that, end quote, that are transferred within the open society, a development that Turner argues could not take place within the closed society. Numerous students and faculty saw it as their duty to inculcate the second curriculum in their peers, students, or colleagues who resided within the same space. As a tradition and ritual of embracing their social responsibilities emerged, it did so within a racialized space that was intentional in its technique and deliberate in its methodology. Black colleges would be unequivocally linked to the freedom of African Americans and carry out this mission for several generations. The college itself was but a space of brick and mortar where various disciplines and academic lessons were passed along to youth in preparation for their transition into the workforce. However, the communitas embodied by Black colleges was much more. Black students and faculty did not simply replicate the routine carried out at white institutions. The relationships that were built and the lessons learned through a second curriculum buoyed the hopes and dreams of the entire race. Much more would be expected of the products of this space. While it is certain that numerous shoulders proved unwilling to carry this burden, the large narrative of HBCUs relays the story of those who welcomed the challenge of creating a blueprint for Black liberation, a vision and a charge that was crafted and fortified within the walls of Black institutions. Black colleges were a crucial waypoint for the freedom struggle as the institutions that produced teachers and ministers who emphasized self-determination, racial responsibility, and service, exposed countless youth to idealism, race conscious, and cultural nationalism, and provided a space where students could engage with their own peers, administrators, or faculty who challenged them to embrace the vision of opportunity and democracy for all. And David, what I really mean in that opening passage is that, again, HBCUs were vastly different from their white counterparts, from predominantly white institutions. We know that in the antebellum era, Ivy League institutions such as Harvard and Yale were teaching classes that, again, completely dismissed the humanity of African Americans, denied the humanity of African Americans, teaching classes on phrenology and studying African Americans in a very subjective manner, as if though they were not part of humankind. Right, and so HBCUs, when in 1837, when the Institute of Colored Youth is created, it immediately again provides a radically different space that emboldens, inspires, and generates the idea of agency amongst Black youth to carry forth the freedom dreams of all African Americans.
So in part, and I know you have some images that we want to talk about to do a few of the milestones along the period you're looking at, but what I'm hearing is, in part, these colleges could be, and universities could be, an antidote to the curriculums of more, at the time, mainstream or white-dominated universities.
Without question. And when you think about schools of thought like William Dunning. William Dunning was a professor at Columbia University who taught that Reconstruction was a horrible mistake, that African Americans should have never been given the right to vote, that African Americans were inferior to whites. And these were ideas that were taught within predominantly white institutions for years and years to come. When I say years and years to come, David, I mean up until the 1960s. This shaped how Reconstruction was taught in American public schools. However, this was not what was taught within the space provided and created within HBCUs. It very much was a very powerful counter narrative. And again, this challenged young African-American students to think of themselves, again, as agents for change. They were exposed to these ideas of race consciousness, which was critically important to counter the ideas of white supremacy. They were exposed to ideas, to idealism, right? As I talk about throughout the book, you know, when I stress idealism, you know, two of the concepts that emerged over and over again throughout the book and throughout the primary sources that I consulted to pull this together were the concepts of citizenship and democracy. Students were constantly being drilled in these ideas of citizenship and democracy, which always struck me as so ironic because those were two of the things that African Americans were denied on a daily basis. But yet here they were being constantly drilled within those concepts. And then the last idea is cultural nationalism, the importance of creating Black spaces, the importance of creating Black businesses, the importance of being, as I talk about in the chapter on Bennett College, race women and race men who understood racial responsibility and that it was their job, their mission, their charge to, again, carry forward the freedom dreams of scores of African Americans who did not have the privilege to go to college.
Do you find the evidence of this concept of really embracing citizenship and democracy for everybody? Because your work starts with about 1837. You know, is that present in the early days of the colleges and universities you're looking at?
Without a doubt, you know, when you look at the chapter on the Institute for Colored Youth, right, one of the major roles that institution played was pushing forth the 15th Amendment, pushing forth the 14th Amendment, lobbying Congress, right, writing senators, encouraging them to support the passage of the 15th Amendment, which of course gave African American men the right to vote, in the 14th Amendment, which of course provided citizenship. So HBCUs, Black colleges from the very beginning, and again, if the Institute for Colored Youth was not alone, right? Along with that, you also had Lincoln University, which was founded also in Pennsylvania, as well as Wilberforce, which was founded in Ohio. These were the three institutions that preceded the Reconstruction era. Most of Black colleges were founded during the Reconstruction period, but there were three institutions that emerged even in the antebellum era. And these institutions from the very beginning embraced this idea that it was going to be their role to produce students who push forth the idea of Black citizenship and push forth the idea of democracy for all.
And I think, you know, if we look at the history of women's suffrage, as well as the history of the early history of the civil rights movement that we're starting with here, they're both very intertwined throughout the 19th century, not always on the same page, but often in alignment. And the fact that you have a chapter that talks about race women, I think just brings that together, that all of the struggles for civil rights and the right to vote in particular are wrapped up with each other.
Without question. As I mentioned this in the talk yesterday, but that chapter on Bennett was the last addition to the book. In fact, that chapter originally was supposed to be a chapter on Howard University during the New Negro era. But when I was on fellowship at Duke, one of my colleagues who was also on fellowship with me, we were talking about my book project and how it was coming along, and I told her I was about to begin work on this last chapter on Howard. Of course, everybody knows the history and legacy of Howard University. They often refer to it as the Mecca and the capstone of the Black educational experience. But she said to me, you know, no one ever talks about Bennett. Right, you know, and I thought about that and I said, you know what, you're right. And I thought that will give me an entire chapter to focus on how these institutions were shaping African-American women during the most radical eras of the 20th century, this new Negro period, wherein, like you mentioned, concepts and ideas of suffrage and citizenship were constantly being pushed for African Americans, African American women. So that chapter I thought was a great addition to the book, and it ended up winning an award on itself as it came out as an article. It was the recipient of the RDW Connor Award from the North Carolina Historical Review. So I was really proud of that chapter, and I think it told a story that really needed to be asserted about the role of Black women in the early 20th century.
Well, I think what you're doing here is you're uplifting parts of history that many people like myself, who are not necessarily experts or scholars in the history of the civil rights movement or Black history, which obviously is American history, you're uplifting a lot of pieces of this era that we may not be that familiar with. It still doesn't start in the 1960s and come forward to today. So I think you have a few images that will illustrate a few points along this historical path. So Amanda, if you would bring up the first of these images, and there's just 4 or 5 for our viewing audience to see. And Jelani, tell us what's going on with this first image.
Okay.
Here we go.
Yes. So that's right on cue, right? I just mentioned and talked about the role of Bennett. These are women at Bennett College in the 1940s, and this is the Bennett College Radio Hours. Bennett is a radio program that the women of Bennett created in Greensboro, North Carolina, during wartime America. The president of Bennett College was David Dallas Jones, who he himself was a race man and a graduate of Morehouse College. But when David Dallas Jones arrives on that campus in 1926, he very much injects the concepts of racial responsibility and even radicalism during that period. But this program served as a very important space where Bennett women could speak about ideas such as African American history, talk about issues such as political concerns related to the Black community. And David, if you don't mind, I do want to read a short portion which kind of highlights that. Do I have time to do that?
No, please do. Go right ahead.
Okay, all right. So this is from the book, and it talks about this radio program. It says, quote, "The radio program also provided a platform for the further construction of Black womanhood. Radio was then, as it still is largely today, a male-dominated industry that provided little room for female voices or on-air personalities. It was highly unusual for women in the 1930s and 1940s to write their own scripts and produce their own show. But Bennett students shattered whatever notions this listening public had about who should be given on-air publicity or what topics should be broached. On one broadcast, a segment entitled Great Names in History featured all African-American women who had served as powerful change agents in American history. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Phyllis Wheatley, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Marian Anderson. Their Negro history class instructor for that semester, John Hope Franklin, surely must have been proud of his students just 2 years after witnessing his students promote African-American history on the Greensboro airwaves. He finished a manuscript that would become a seminal contribution to the field entitled From Slavery to Freedom, a history of Negro Americans. The influence of such developments were far-reaching as Bennett students were exposed to visiting scholars and molded by the women and men who were essential to their vibrant communities. They were empowered to carry the gospel of social justice and equality with them into the communities they were charged to serve." And so I think what's so important about this image, David, and what I just read, it shows the communitas at work. This is carving out a space for young Black women to express themselves, to gain career opportunities, but more importantly, to connect with the surrounding community, both Black and white, and expose this second curriculum of race consciousness and idealism and cultural nationalism. And then how about that last line? Their Black history professor was John Hope Franklin, who taught all over the South and taught at a number of HBCUs. But for those who are in the chat, or those who are listening, if you don't know who John Hope Franklin is, this is one of the most preeminent scholars of American history of the 20th century, Black or white or otherwise, right? So think about being in a space where John Hope Franklin is your history professor, right? And then going on air and sharing the messages that you've learned from class with the broader community. So again, this shows this environment really at work here in a very critical way.
I was struck by your mention of communitas in the introduction, and I think you're referencing it here also. It conjures up for me an image of a safe space to be yourself, to bring your full humanity to in this case the educational space. Um, and it's almost like as a reaction to, or a space that is safe from what is going on in the rest of society. This is actually close to the heart of many libraries as we try and make sure that we construct spaces that are safe for whoever needs to pursue a particular interest or topic or project.
Right, and thus the title of the book, Shelter in a Time of Storm, right? And of course, for those who aren't familiar with the history and legacy of the Black church, I actually took that title from an old gospel song. I'm a preacher's kid, and I heard that song so many times growing up, and I thought it was just such an adequate way to describe what these institutions really represented at the height of racial terrorism within this country, at the height of Jim Crow laws being further and more deeply enforced throughout American political and social life. These institutions provided a space, as you mentioned, to again, not just shelter and nurture Black youth, but also to empower them, again, to become change agents and to take these messages out into the community. And that ultimately, of course, bore fruit, right? Again, we think of the civil rights movement that explodes upon the scene in the 1960s. Almost all the people associated with that movement, many of them are products of historically Black colleges and universities where they've been exposed to the second curriculum.
And do we see this spreading beyond the South in terms of Black universities and Black colleges, or at what point does this become more than a focus of the colleges that you're focused on in this particular book?
I think without a doubt. I mean, again, you talk about this idea and notion of space and how educational institutions, or as I refer to in my introduction, these interstitial spaces, right? A space within a space. What happens when a teacher goes into their classroom and closes that door? That space becomes theirs, right? And they can talk about what they want to, teach about what they want to, right? And not only that, but engage the youth of tomorrow in ways in which they find most beneficial. And I think one of the best examples of that, which I'll tie into your comment, is look at the history of the Black Panther Party. A lot of folks don't really understand and know this, but the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense began as a student group at Merritt College in Oakland, California, right? And so, and they were being exposed to a set curriculum all on their own. Even though Merritt College was not a historically Black college or university, students found a space where they could nurture each other and inspire and embolden each other, and then find a way to try to remedy problems within their community. And thus the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was born. So education is often really kind of played that role. There's a quote that I use in the opening of the book from W.E. Du Bois, who says that education has always, played a role in creating a space of discontent, right? It should shake you up. It should, if it's done properly, it should provoke you to think very critically about the society around you and how you can change it for the better. And that's exactly what HBCUs were doing throughout the early and mid 20th century. And those concepts carried over to other students at other institutions, even predominantly white institutions, where again, a number of young white students were very much inspired by the sit-ins that they saw taking place around them and joined the movement because of that.
Well, I think there's a truth to seeing that, the safe space for critical thinking to emerge is then what can allow any group of humans to move beyond just understanding and information to action and to bring about change. So I think we see this, the deeper you go into looking at each of these moments in the university history, we see this, right in front of us. So thank you for putting this in black and white on paper. Let's take the next image or two and go from there. So who are we looking at here?
One of my favorite people in history. This is Joanne Robinson. Joanne Robinson was the English professor, a longtime English professor at Alabama State University. But more importantly, she was one of the principal architects of the Montgomery bus boycott. Here's a Black woman in the Deep South, deliberately and specifically recruited by Harper Council Trenholm, who was the president of Alabama State University, to come to Alabama State University and teach students there. But when she arrives, the type of atmosphere that she creates, the type of messages that she is translating to her students, again, it empowers them. It inspires them to think very critically about the society around them, and more importantly, how they can change and how they should change that society around them. And this is her arrest photo. Of course, she was arrested for her involvement in the Montgomery bus boycott. But I always show this photo to my students when I'm teaching, and I always tell them she is one of my favorite people, because that's an image of a woman who's very proud, right? She is not ashamed for what she's done. She stood up for first-class citizenship and democracy and justice. And just think about how that could inspire and encourage the students who are under her charge. And in fact, if you guys could cue up that next image under the article, White Supremacy is Faltering, this is exactly what I mean. I'm not sure how closely for those who are in the audience, if you can see this or read this, but again, this is the communitas at work. This is the second curriculum at work. This is an article from the December 1955 edition of the Freshmore newspaper. The Freshmore newspaper was a newspaper at Alabama State University, which was completely written by freshmen and sophomore students at Alabama State University, which is why it was called the Freshmore. But this article is written by Loretta Jean Thomas. And of course, look at the title, Is White Supremacy Faltering? And again, let me be very clear about this. And I was very deliberate in saying December 1955. Of course, we all know, or hopefully those who are students of history, all know what was going on in Montgomery in December of 1955. The bus boycott just breaks out in the city. Again, Joanne Robinson has played a critical role in shaping that. The Women's Political Council, who are a group of women professors at Alabama State University, have played a critical role in shaping that. And so what was, I think, so powerful about this particular piece is that it's an antecedent. This precedes the boycott itself, because this comes out December of 1955. This is the December 1955 edition, which means that this story had to be written in November. Right? They couldn't, this is not like now where they have to, we can just instantly turn things in.
Not the 24-hour news cycle, for sure.
Exactly. And so they had already been prepping and preparing these comments, and it comes out in the December 1955 edition at the same time that the bus boycott is unfolding. But look very closely, I'm not sure if you can see it, but if you look very closely to the left, it says who the faculty advisor is for the newspaper. And who is it? Miss Joanne Robinson. Right. And so, again, this shows, as one of my graduate professors once said, when he was reading my dissertation, he said, this kind of sounds like, sort of, again, using the Black church as a metaphor. He says, it sounds like a laying on of hands kind of moment for those who aren't Baptists from the Baptist tradition. The idea of laying on of hands is that you're passing energy and synergy into those who you are touching, right? And that you are touching and agreeing, and that you are passing on a message. And this is a message of hope and empowerment. And think about the idea that the same woman who was an NAACP member and a part of the Women's Political Council and pushing forth this boycott of her, inspired by her friend Rosa Parks. This is the type of woman who's educating Black youth at Alabama State University. And lo and behold, Loretta Jean Thomas writes an article that says, "Is white supremacy faltering?" in 1955. And I can't tell you how radical that is, right? How militant that is. This is 1955 Montgomery, Alabama. So for a student to use a newspaper space to raise this question, which, by the way, you can't read the entire article. I could provide you a clipping of it. But at the end of this article, she says, it absolutely is faltering. White supremacy is on its deathbed, and we're going to make sure that we hasten its death. Right? These are the type of students who are emerging. These are the type of lessons that they are learning. And again, this is we're 5 years away from the student sit-ins, which explode on Black college campuses in 1960. Here in 1955, Alabama State University students are already prepped and primed and ready to take on white supremacy.
And willing to call it as white supremacy.
Absolutely.
Right.
Which in itself was dangerous in 1955
I'm sure.
Montgomery, Alabama. But again, as you mentioned, they're in a safe space. right? They're in a shelter and they feel empowered by that shelter. And so I'll briefly mention this. The student newspapers were really the major source of this book in terms of primary sources that I consulted. And it's just an absolute gold mine of radical political thought, which showed who students were being exposed to, not just their faculty members like Joanne Robinson, but again, a endless carousel of Black leaders and activists are visiting these campuses and talking with these students and encouraging these students and inspiring these students to, again, think of themselves as change agents. And they use the pages of these student newspapers to express that angst, to express their frustrations with white supremacy, to implore their fellow students to become engaged in this burgeoning movement. So Black college student newspapers are one of the most incredible primary sources that I consulted throughout the course of this study.
And a great reminder that as a society, we truly have to preserve the integrity of the campus identity as safe space now in the 21st century, so that, for tomorrow's safe spaces, we still have the same opportunity for this kind of communitas, for sure. And I think, we see the third level education system challenged by commercialization, by ideology also. And so this is a great reminder of the power of universities and colleges as a source for societal change.
Absolutely.
Let's move to the next image. I think we have one more.
So again, this is from 1965, and of course, and it's also Alabama. And again, as we were reminded by the sudden passing, the tragic passing of John Lewis, Alabama was a hot spot in the 1960s and the 1950s. Here you see an image of Alabama State University students joining together with Tuskegee University students, both institutions, of course, located in Alabama, not far from one another at all. But they decided to show up in solidarity to march to the Capitol, right? To march to the Capitol, to confront the governor, to go into the very halls and the seats of white supremacy and white power, and to demand equality, to demand first-class citizenship. And so again, I just love the image itself because it shows solidarity, it shows strength, it shows fortitude of students determined to carry out this. It also shows discipline. Right? These are students who are all kind of, 2 by 2, right, shoulder by shoulder. And then, of course, I love the photo of the young lady wearing the Alabama State University T-shirt with her skirt there. So again, it's just another powerful image which shows the type of students that were being produced during this time period. There's a great interview from Gwen Patton, who recently passed away, but Gwen Patton was an activist at Tuskegee, and she talked about the power of the humanities at these institutions. And she said that, look, we were exposed to African-American history. We were reading the humanities. We were reading philosophy. We were reading all these critical ideas, and Vietnam was going on, and the civil rights movement was going on. And so she talked about that in the sense that, how could our administrators think that nothing else would have come out of this but activism, right? But protests, right? And so again, it goes back to this idea of deliberate, intentional space. When you expose students to these type of ideas, which promote citizenship and democracy and equality and egalitarianism, at some point, they're going to take it to heart. Right? At some point, they're going to begin to believe these ideas. And so that's what you're seeing here. And in fact, if I could just read one more passage, just to highlight what comes out of this. And I read a portion of this last night, but I'll be very brief here in summing up how and what Alabama State University students were thinking in this kind of similar time period and time era. This is in 1960 with the sit-ins that explode on the scene. So this is 5 years prior to this photo. But it says, quote, immediately recognizing that it was a mandate from the governor. And again, the state government stepped in to try to shut down the state institution, to try to corral and to reel in people like President Harper Council Trenholm and people like Joanne Robinson. Well, this is what they said about it. Immediately recognizing that it was a mandate from the governor, the students directly petitioned Patterson and once again revealed the residual effects of the second curriculum embedded within them. They said, quote, "We, a united group of students of said college, humbly request that you reconsider your order to President Trenholm," end quote. Addressing the paradox of segregation, a topic that they continuously discussed in the communitas that enveloped them, they continued, saying, quote, "It is a flagrant contradiction of the Christian and democratic ideals of our nation. One can only imagine how startled Patterson must have been. Black students attending the school that he and generations of Southern whites had attempted to cripple through decades of underfunding were taking him to school on the topic of ethics and American government. Their final retort may have caused Patterson even more consternation. Without flinching, the students declared, our behavior was in line with what we have been taught." Right. So again, this is a payoff. This is a smoking gun evidence of students saying we've been drilled in these ideas of democracy and citizenship and race consciousness, and this is what you get, Alabama. Right. This is the byproduct of years of that type of exposure, and so these are just incredibly valuable and critical spaces which have played a critical role in shaping the freedom dreams of Black folks, but more importantly, radically transforming and changing the political contours of America. We don't have a Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act without the pressure that was generated from student activism throughout the South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, CORE, all of it was powered through student activism. And overwhelmingly, these were students who emerged from and who were trained at historically Black colleges and universities.
The calling for the good trouble, to quote the late John Lewis.
This is good trouble.
Absolutely.
This is absolutely good trouble.
How intentional, even going back to 1837, where the leaders or the founders of these colleges and universities to, that yes, it would lead to this type of change. Was it more about creating a safe space for, to continue our use of that term, for Black youth, or was there a vision that this would bring about societal change along the lines of citizenship and democracy that you talked about?
Black colleges were founded for two primary purposes: to educate ministers and to train teachers. This is why these institutions were largely created. But in that space, what we see immediately from the very beginning is that we see Black administrators and Black educators using a second curriculum. This is why I refer to it as a second curriculum, right? Again, they know that in order to achieve accreditation and to be recognized as a viable and credible educational institution, that they're going to have to teach chemistry. They're going to have to teach math and science and history and Latin and Greek and rhetoric and all the things they would learn in the 19th century and early 20th century. But they also understood that space would be valuable in serving as a catalyst to push forward, again, the freedom dreams of Black folks. You look at the Institute for Colored Youth, which was founded in 1837, the first historically Black college and university, but you see people like Charles Reason. Charles Reason was a graduate of the African Free School of New York, which was founded in 1787, right? So in the midst of this American Revolution, we see an institution being created in New York, and out of this institution, you get a number of Black activists emerging. Henry Highland Garnett is a graduate of the African Free School in New York City in 1787. And these are the type of people who begin to travel within these spaces, who are coming to the Institute of Colored Youth, who are giving talks at the Institute of Colored Youth. You see people like Ebenezer Bassett, who was really played a critical role in shaping the direction of that institution. But it's under Ebenezer Bassett, who's the principal of the Institute for Colored Youth in the 1850s, that you see Black youth like Octavius Catto, right? And John Ransom and some of the other people that I talk about in that chapter. You see him really kind of shepherding them and nurturing them and encouraging them to use their voices as to push for, again, a 14th Amendment and a 15th Amendment, which these students do, right? They lobby the Senate, they lobby Congress to say, look, we are in full support of pushing forward these amendments, which will empower future generations of Black folks. You see people like Fannie Jackson Coppin. I'm not sure, for those who are familiar with Coppin State University in Baltimore, it's named after Fannie Jackson Coppin, who of course went on to become a principal after Ebenezer Bassett became the principal of the Institute for Colored Youth. And these are race men and race women from the very beginning, long before the New Negro movement emerged in the 19-teens and 1920s. Institutions such as the Institute for Colored Youth in the 19th century, in the 1840s and 1850s, were creating an atmosphere that was inextricably linked with the idea of freedom for all African Americans. And they used that space, again, not just to teach math and science and history, but also to use the second curriculum to power forward those dreams.
I want to jump forward to North Carolina A&T because I think that's where your degree is from, and it also figures in the book. So did that become a little different kind of experience to do research on the college that you were attending? And what did you find, and what did you already know what you were looking for, or did something surprise you about that particular piece of research?
I am a graduate of A&T. My father was a graduate of A&T. My mother's a graduate of A&T. So, and this is the case with a lot of these institutions. And I think higher education in general, right? You have these legacies where people go to college where their parents often went because they've heard and been exposed to that space. But the main reason I write about North Carolina A&T during the Black Power movement is it's because of a mentor of mine, William Chafe, who was a longtime professor at Duke University, wrote his classic study entitled Civilities and Civil Rights. And this, of course, has been vetted to be true, that Greensboro, North Carolina was, without a doubt, the center of the Black Power movement in the 1960s in the Deep South. Right? And so in the South, there was no other city that was on fire in terms of the Black Power movement like Greensboro, North Carolina. And the main reason why that was the case was because of the presence of North Carolina A&T. It produced a number of the local leaders. It produced, of course, people like Jesse Jackson, who went on to become a major voice during the Civil Rights movement, as well as the Black Power movement. And so I think looking at this chapter on A&T, what it really kind of illustrated was the importance of HBCUs during the Black Power era. And when you look at the historiography, we often lose sight of that because so much of the scholarship, pre-existing scholarship that existed, looked at the rise of Black studies programs at predominantly white institutions. They looked at San Francisco State and Kent State and some of those other developments that took place at predominantly white institutions. Well, we largely often ignore the legacy of the Black Power movement at HBCUs. So I knew that if I was going to talk about the Black Power movement at a Black college, I wanted to talk about an institution that was central to that movement. And it just so happened to be that North Carolina A&T was that institution. So yes, I'm a proud graduate of A&T, Aggie pride all day. But it just proved to be one of the best institutions that I could use as an example to talk about how Black colleges were still very much central to the freedom dreams of Black people, even in the midst of the Black Power movement.
I know we're not going to have enough time to go over all of the material that's in the book or things I wanted to talk about, but let me take one question that has come in so far and invite others to put a couple more in, and then I do want to talk about where we are today as well after that.
Sure.
So Elizabeth asks, please describe how you located the archival materials that you used in your research, the richness of them that you found, and maybe what was missing or what seemed to be missing.
Great question. This, like most historians, we live and breathe on primary sources. And we try and we strive to find fresh primary sources that have not been consulted or maybe have been consulted that you have a different angle and a different interpretation of them than the previous scholar. And so I knew from the very beginning, looking at, again, I took classes like the history of Black education at Ohio State. I knew from the very beginning, looking at the canon, looking at the pre-existing literature, that many folks who had written and described HBCUs, they talked about colorism, they talked about conservatism, they talked about paternalism of these institutions, which many of those stories certainly proved to be true. I never tried to describe Black colleges as some sort of perfect space, but there were indeed a number of holes that were left there, because how do you produce someone like Ella Baker? Right? How do you produce someone like Stokely Carmichael? How do we get someone like a Diane Nash or a John Lewis? And no one had ever really described that to my satisfaction. And so it encouraged me to look at student newspapers to try to uncover these stories. And was mentioned last night in the award ceremony, but Black college archives are some of the most valuable spaces, but at the same time, some of the most misused spaces. They are not supported by many of the institutions that they are situated at. They're often ignored. They don't receive a lot of funding. So it was a challenge. And I actually mentioned this in the acknowledgement section of my book. At the outset of this study, there were a number of institutions that I wanted to also include that ultimately I had to end up cutting out because of the shortcomings of their archives. Right? And so having to go to 7 different institutions and dig through archives, which again were often ignored and underfunded, it was indeed a challenge. I'll tell this one story. There was one institution that I talk about in the book where I was digging through this old rusty file cabinet in the archives, and I felt an obstruction in the back of one of the files. And so I pulled it out, I reached my hand back in there, and it was a crumpled up piece of paper. And I pulled out the paper, and lo and behold, it's a handwritten letter from W.E.B. Du Bois to the college president. Right? And I was just floored. And of course, I immediately sought out the archivist and said, we've got to find a way to try to not just preserve this, but we've got to get you some more support. And so I implore all of those who are interested in preserving the history and legacy of Black colleges to invest in the archives of these institutions, because there are indeed a number of gold mine resources that can be found here. And I think I was able to very much consult them in this study. And I think in doing so, it brought the study to life. But without question, these are very valuable spaces, but they're also largely ignored spaces. And I think that's tragic.
Yeah. Sometimes even when we know what we have, we don't understand its significance also. So amazing to bring that to light. I'm intrigued by the title of the epilogue. Because I'll just read it for those who don't have the book in front of them. It's a different world, the rise of the hip hop generation, and the corruption of the Black college communitas. Please unpack that for a minute or two.
So I am 45 years old. I was born in 1975. For those who are close to my age, they'll know exactly what that title means. A Different World was a television show that came out in the late 1980s. It was a spinoff of The Cosby Show. It followed the story of Denise Huxtable as she attended her parents' alma mater, the fictional HBCU Hillman College, located in Virginia. But this show inspired generations of young people during an era of what I often refer to as the sort of a golden renaissance of Black colleges. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, Black colleges really soared in popularity. And I give examples of that in that epilogue. I talk about A Different World. There's a television show in prime time on NBC, which focused on Black college life and really exposed the second curriculum. It really exposed ideas of how students at HBCUs were nurtured and how they often engaged political and social issues of their day. So it was really a great platform for exposing Black college life to millions of Black folks across the country and to white America as well. This for many young white folks who are my age, A Different World was probably their first introduction to Black college life as well. But you also had movies like School Days from Spike Lee, which focused on Black college life. You also had again, a variety of hip hop artists wearing Black college sweatshirts, which became extremely popular in the late 80s and 90s. So when I talk about It's a Different World, I talk about the importance of that era in the 80s and 90s, but I also come back to the idea that HBCUs were indeed very much changing during this time period. This is why I describe it as the corruption of that communitas, the spacing itself, the set curriculum itself, which again, I go back to that interview from Gwen Patton from the 1980s, where she said, hey, we were exposed to a litany of ideas from the humanities and social sciences, and that inspired us and emboldened us to engage in activism. those concepts and ideas were very much weakened in the 80s and 90s as HBCUs turned towards STEM and other business programs and began to fund those programs more than they funded education and social sciences and humanities. And it had a disastrous effect, David. And so I talk about that throughout the epilogue in terms of how that weakened the ability of HBCUs to continue to serve as catalysts for activism and social revolution in the 20th century, as well as one can make the argument for the 21st century as well.
Yeah, I think we're half answering my good friend Priscilla Douglas, who's also a library trustee's question that has just come in, which is what impact does the push or had the push on STEM have on the social justice actions, which more often stem from broader humanistic critical thinking curricula. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here, and it probably has an even worse effect in the traditionally Black colleges and universities than in the rest of the third level education in the U.S.
No, without a question. There's a article, and again, we talk about the gold mines that you often find in these Black college archives. But there was a letter from a professor at Southern University in 1957. His name was Dr. Rodney Higgins. And Dr. Rodney Higgins was really the founder of what ultimately became Black political science in America. Southern University had one of the most powerful political science departments in the country. And Rodney Higgins was the creator of that. And in doing so, he hired other people to come and teach political science at Southern University in Baton Rouge. But he also hired or trained generations of Black political scientists who would go out and transform the field. But there's a letter from him in 1957 where he's speaking to a body of educators where he warns of he sees the writing on the wall. He says, look, we are moving forward, and I think that we're going to see a weakening of the social sciences, and that concerned him. It bothered him because he believed that indeed, if we're going to train and educate people to transform our society, they have to be educated in what citizenship and democracy really mean, right? And so he warned people about the inability to produce students who can think critically about the world around them, and more importantly, produce solutions to those problems that they see around them if they haven't been trained in those ideas. And so this is from 1957. Rodney Higgins was warning about this, was concerned about this. And sure enough, you fast forward to the 80s and 90s, and this is not just an issue that plagues Black colleges. I think predominantly white institutions as well, institutions of higher education across America have wholeheartedly and full-throatedly embraced STEM and business, and in doing so have shunned the humanities and have shunned social sciences and education. And as I always tell people, this is not to denigrate those fields. I think it's important for us to have very rich and fully developed STEM programs, particularly at on Black college campuses. But if we're not training people to think critically about how to use those skills to solve social and political and economic problems confronting our most marginalized communities, then I think that we're going to continue to see this gap in empathy and a gap in understanding about the importance of those communities that are hit the hardest by racism and white supremacy and sexism and all these other ideas.
So we're almost at time, but I'd like to close with offering you the opportunity to comment as a historian on where we are in 2020. I'll put a hypothesis out there, which you can either reject or comment on or do with as you will. But since the killing of George Floyd in particular, and the death of other Black individuals that have come to note in the national media, a range of protests to get obviously almost exclusively peaceful and determined and similar to the little image that we saw earlier in tonight's program. The hypothesis is that there may be a new appetite in the US consciousness for confronting the legacy of racism and systemic racism and racial equity. clearly this is not a new problem. Clearly these deaths are not the first, nor unfortunately may they be the last. I wish they were. But do you think there's a new appetite? Will it be sustained? Does it map to other periods in time that you've looked at, maybe in researching for this book?
I think that's yet to be answered, David, honestly, in terms of will this be sustained. That's always, I'm a social movement historian by training. And so as a social movement historian, one of the things that we understand about social movements is that they ebb and flow. And when you look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, there were ebb and flow periods. But for the most part, this was a movement that maintained its energy and direction for an entire decade. Right. When we look at the contemporary events that are taking place, I think it's great that we're finally capturing many of these images because of our cell phones, and we can see police brutality in real time. We can see racism and people engaging in racist actions in real time. But one of the things I think is critically important is that we cannot reduce the idea of activism to T-shirt justice, right? I'll wear it on a T-shirt, or I'll tweet this, and I'll use social media. Social media can be an incredible platform, but it can also, of course, as we clearly are seeing in 2020, can also be an incredible space for misinformation, right? And so I think it's important that we continue to create and develop spaces, spaces that educate, spaces that offer counter narrative, spaces that fully recognize the humanity of all Americans. And again, this is what Black colleges have often served as that type of space. And the humanities and social sciences have been a powerful engine for that type of critical thought. And so moving forward, I do see, I certainly see the potential. But I'll close with this example. The Dream Defenders. I'm not sure if people remember the Dream Defenders, but the Dream Defenders was an organization that emerged out of the murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida. And this is one of the earlier organizations, along with the Black Lives Matter movement, that began to channel some of that energy around frustration and anger about these deaths, which were finally being caught on video. Again, Sandra Bland and Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and all these other folks who were murdered like 4 or 5, 6 years ago. But one of the things that the Dream Defenders concluded with is that, hey, we're starting to lose control of our message on social media. And they literally called for a moratorium from their members from social media to stop tweeting. Let's reconnect with our communities around us. Let's build relationships with the communities around us, and talk to folks and find out what their needs are in order to address that. And again, I think that is what's important about that social relationship, which is often built within the HBCU communities, right? The idea of creating relationships where we can be empathetic to not just, again, our peers who attend these institutions, but also be empathetic about the communities that surround them. Let's find out what these problems are. Let's think about solutions to address these issues. And more importantly, let's use this space provided to us to empower those dreams, to empower those ideas. And so again, whether it's historically Black colleges, or whether it's predominantly white institutions, or whether it's libraries or other institutions, we have to be able to, as you say, become caretakers and custodians of the space around us, and to generate the type of freedom dreams that we want to see for all Americans.
Well, Jelani, thank you so much for sharing your work with us, sharing your book with us, sharing your thoughts on history and today with us. Congratulations again on the award. Good luck with the rest of the virtual book tour that I'm assuming that you are on. And let's just bring up the closing slide. Please go to the Museum of African American History's website for more information, for more access to this book and others by Dr. Favors and other Stone Book Award winners and finalists. You can, of course, check out books from your local library, the Boston Public Library, or an independent bookstore to further your knowledge and education. My thanks go to Pam Waterman at MAAH, all of you for attending, our great staff at the BPL, and once again, Dr. Jelani Favors, thank you and congratulations. And please be aware of these upcoming programs and also others in the BPL's Arc of History series. Thank you and see you next time.